is The History of the Waldenses by J.A. Wylie. Um, Trying to get all settled here. Tonight I will be reading from the Preface and Chapter 1. Preface. This work, which is a reprint of the 16th book of the history of Protestantism, is exclusively occupied with the subject of the Waldenses. It describes succulently the conflicts they waged and the martyrdoms they endured in defense of their faith and their liberty, and is published in the present form to meet the requirements of those who take a special interest in this remarkable people. Recent events in Europe have brought the Waldenses into prominence and thrown a new light upon the grandeur of their struggle and the important and enduring issues which have flowed from it. To them, in a very particular manner, we we to trace the constitutional liberties which Italy at this hour enjoys. In the eventful year of 1848, when a new constitution was being framed for Piedmont, the Waldenses made it plain to the government that there would not be standing room for them within the lines of that constitution unless it embraced the great principle of freedom of conscience. For that principle, they had contended during 500 years, and nothing short of it could they accept as a basis of national settlement, persuaded that any other guarantee of their liberties would be illus- illusory. Illusory? I don't know what that word is. Their demand was conceded. The principle of freedom of conscience, the root of all liberty, was embodied in the new constitution, and thus the whole inhabitants of Piedmont shared equally with the Waldenses in a boon which the struggles of the latter had been mainly instrumental in securing. Not only so, in process of time, the constitution of Piedmont was extended to the rest of Italy, and the whole Italian nation is at this hour sharing in the fruits which have sprung from the toil and the blood, the unswerving faith and heroic devotion of the Waldenses. Nor is their work finished even yet. They have understood the end for which they have been preserved through so many ages of darkness and conflict, and have energetically thrown themselves into the evangelization of modern Italy. And doubtless these ancient confessors are destined to win in the land where they endured so many dark sorrows, not a few brilliant triumphs, and by the labors of the present to add to the obligations which Christendom owes them for the service of the past. J.A. Wylie. Chapter 1. The Waldenses, their valleys. It was the ninth century, and superstitious beliefs and idolatrous rites were overspreading the church when Claudius, Bishop of Turin, who was deeply imbued with the spirit of Augustine, set himself to arrest the growing corruption with all the fervor of a living faith and the vigor of a courageous and powerful intellect. To the battle for the purity of doctrine, he joined that for the independence of the churches of Lombardy. Even in Claude's day, they remained free, although many churches more remote from Rome had already been subjugated by that all conquering power. The Ambrosian liturgy was still used in the Cathedral of Milan, and the Augustinian doctrine continued to be preached from many of the pulpits of Lombardy and Piedmont. This independence of Rome and this greater purity of faith and worship, these churches mainly owe to the three apostolic men whose names adorn their annals: Ambrose, let's see, Vigilantinus, and Claude. When Claude went to his grave about the year 840, the battle, although not altogether dropped, was but languidly maintained. Attempts were renewed to induce the bishops of Milan to accept the episcopal pall, the badge of spiritual vassalage, from the Pope. But it was not till the middle of the 11th century, 1059, under Nicholas II, that these attempts were successful. Petrus Damianus, bishop of Ostia, and Anselm, bishop of Lusa, were dispatched by the pontiff to receive the submission of the Lombard churches. The popular tumults amid which that submission was extorted sufficiently show that the spirit of Claude still lingered at the foot of the Alps. Nor did the clergy conceal the regret with which they surrendered their ancient liberties to a power before which the whole earth was then bowing down. For the papal legate Daminus informs us that the clergy of Milan maintained in his presence that the Ambrosian Church, according to the ancient institutions of the Fathers, was always free, without being subject to the laws of Rome, and that the Pope of Rome had no jurisdiction over their church as to the government or constitution of it. But if the plains were conquered, not so the mountains. A considerable body of protesters stood out against this deed of submission. Of these, some crossed the Alps, descended the Rhine, and raised the standard of opposition in the diocese of Cologne, where they were branded as Manicheans and rewarded with the stake. Others retired into the valleys of the Piedmontese Alps and there maintained their scriptural faith and their ancient independence. What has just been related respecting the diocese of Milan and Turin settles the question of the apostolicity, apostolicity. I can't say that word. It's apostolicity, apostolicity of the churches of the Waldensian valleys. It is not necessary to show that missionaries were sent from Rome in the first age to plant Christianity in these valleys, nor is it necessary to show that these churches have existed as distinct and separate communities from earlier days. Enough that they formed a part, as unquestionably they did, of the great evangelical church of the north of Italy. This is the proof at once of this apostolicity and their independence. It attests their descent from apostolic men, if doctrine be the life of churches. When their co-religionists on the plains entered within the pale of the Roman jurisdiction, they retired within the mountains, and spurning alike the tyrannical yoke and the corrupt tenets of the Church of the Seven Hills, they preserved in its purity and simplicity the faith their fathers had handed down to them. Rome, manifestly, was the schismatic. She it was that had abandoned what was once the common faith of Christendom, leaving by that step to all who remained on the old ground the indisputable valid title of the true church. Behind this rampart of mountains, which Providence, foreseeing the approach of evil days, would almost seem to have reared on purpose, did the remnant of the early apostolic church of Italy kindle their lamp, and here did that lamp continue to burn all through the long night which descended on Christendom. There is a singular concurrence of evidence in favor of their high antiquity. Their traditions invariably point to an unbroken descent from the earliest times as regards their religious beliefs. The Nobla Lican, which dates from the year 1100, goes to prove that the Waldenses of Piedmont did not owe their rise to Peter Waldo of Lyons, who did not appear till the latter half of that century, 1169. The Nobla Lican, though a poem, is in reality a confession of faith and could have been composed only after some considerable study of the system of Christianity in contradistinction to the errors of Rome. How could a church have arisen with such a document in her hands? Or how could these herdsmen and vine dressers shut up in their mountains have detected the errors against which they bore testimony and found their way to the truths of which they made open profession in times of darkness like these? If we grant that their religious beliefs were the heritage of former ages handed down from and evangelical ancestry, all is plain. But if we maintain that they were the discovery of the men of those days, we assert what approaches almost to a miracle. Their greatest enemy, Claude Cicel of Turin, 1517, and Reinerius the Inquisitor, 1250, have admitted their antiquity and stigmatized them as the most dangerous of all heretics because the most ancient. Rocinco, prior of St. Roch, Turin, 1640, was employed to investigate the origin and antiquity of the Waldenses, and of course had access to all the Waldensian documents in the ducal archives. And being their bittered enemy, he may be presumed to have made his report not more favorable than he could help. Yet he states that they were not a new sect in the ninth and 10th centuries, and that Claude of Turin must have detached them from the church in the ninth century. Within the limits of her own land, did God provide a dwelling for this venerable church? Let us bestow a glance upon the region. As one comes from the south across the level plain of Piedmont, while yet nearly 100 miles off, one sees the Alps rise before one, stretching like a great wall along the horizon. From the gates of the morning to those of the setting sun, the mountains run on in a line of towering magnificence. Pasturages and chestnut forests clothe their base, eternal snows crown their summits. How varied are their forms! Some rise like castles of stupendous strength, others shoot up tall and tapering like needles, while others again run along in serrated lines, their summits torn and cleft by the storms of many thousand winters. At the hour of sunrise, what a glory kindles along the crest of that snowy rampart. At sunset, the spectacle is again renewed, and a line of no, pyres is seen to burn in the evening sun, drawing nearer the hills on a line about 30 miles west of Turin. There opens before one what seems a great mountain portal. This is the entrance to the Waldensen territory. A low hill drawn along in front serves as a defense against all who may come with hostile intent, as but too frequently happened in times gone by, while a stupendous monolith, the Castel Luzo, shoots up to the clouds and stands sentinel at the gate of this renowned region. As one approaches Lo Torri, the Castel Uzo rises higher and higher and irresistibly fixes the eye by the perfect beauty of its pillar like form. But to this mountain a higher interest belongs than any that mere symmetry can give it. It is indissolubly linked with martyr memories and borrows a halo from the achievements of the past. How often in days of old was the confessor hurled sheer down its awful steep and dashed on the rocks at its foot, and there commingled in one ghastly heap, growing ever the bigger and ghastlier as another and yet another victim was added to it, lay the mangled bodies of pastor and peasant, of mother and child. It was the tragedies connected with this mountain mainly that called forth Milton's noble sonnet. Avenge, O Lord, thy slaughtered saints, whose bones lie scattered on the Alpine mountains cold, who were thy sheep, and in their ancient fold, slain by the bloody Piedmontese that rolled. Mother with infant down the rocks, their moans, the vales redoubled to the hills, and they to heaven. The Waldensian valleys are seven in number. They were more in ancient times, but the limits of the Vendouse territory have undergone repeated curtailment, and now only seven remain, lying between Pinerolo on the east and Monte Viso on the west. Thy pyramidal hill, which forms so prominent an object from every part of the plain of Piedmont, towering as it does above the surrounding mountains, and like a horn of silver cutting the ebon of the firmament. The first three valleys run out somewhat like the spokes of a wheel, the spot on which we stand, the gateway, namely, being the nave. The first is Lucerner, uh, Lucerna, or Valley of Light. It runs right out in a grand gorge of some 12 miles in length and about two in width. It wears a carpeting of meadows, which the waters of the Pelis kept ever fresh and bright. A profusion of vines, acacias, and mulberry trees fleck it with their shadows, and a wall of lofty mountains encloses it on either hand. The second is Rora, or Valley of Dews. It is a vast cup, some 50 miles in circumference. Its sides, luxur, luxuriantly clothed with meadow and cornfield, with fruit and forest trees, and its rim formed of craggy and peaked mountains, many of them snow clad. The third is Angorgona, or Valley of Groans. Of it we shall speak more particularly afterwards. Beyond the extremity of the first three valleys are the remaining four, forming, as it were, the rim of the wheel. These last are enclosed in their turn by a line of lofty mountains, which form a wall of defense around the entire territory. Each valley is a fortress having its own gate of ingress and egress, with its caves and rocks and mighty chestnut trees, forming places of retreat and shelter, so that the highest engineering skill could not have better adapted each several valleys to this very purpose. It is not less remarkable that, taking all these valleys together, each is so related to each, the one opening into the other, that they may be said to form one fortress of amazing and matchless strength, wholly impregnable, in fact. All the fortresses of Europe, though combined, would not form a citadel so enormously strong and so dazzlingly magnificent as the mountain dwelling of the Vandus. The eternal, the eternal, our God, says Leger, having destined his land to be the theater of his marvels and the bulwark of his art, has by natural means most marvelously forfeited it. The battle begun in one valley could be continued in another and carried around the entire territory, till at last the invading foe, overpowered by the rocks, rolled down him from the mountains, or assailed by enemies which would start suddenly out of the midst or issue from some unsuspected cave, found retreat impossible, and, cut off in detail, left his bones to whiten the mountains he had come to subdue. These valleys are lovely and fertile, as well as strong. They are watered by numerous torrents, which descend from the snows of the summits, the grassy carpet of their bottom, the mantling vine and the golden grain of their lower slopes, the chalets that dot their sides, sweetly embowered amid fruit trees, and higher up the great chestnut forests and the pasture lands where the herdsmen keep watch over their flocks all through the summer days and the starlit nights, the nodding crags from which the torrent leaps into the light, the rivulet singing with quiet gladness in the shady nook, the mists moving grandly among the mountains, now veiling, now revealing their majesty, and the far off summits tipped with silver to be changed at eve into gleaming gold, make up a picture of blended beauty and grandeur, not equaled, perhaps, and certainly not surpassed in any other region of the earth. In the heart of their mountains is situated the most interesting, perhaps, of all their valleys. It was in this retreat, walled round by hills whose heads touch heaven, that their barbs or pastors from all their several parishes were wont to meet in annual synod. It was here that their college stood, and it was here that their missionaries were trained. and after ordination were sent forth to sow the good seed as opportunity offered in other lands. Let us visit this valley. We ascend to it by the long, narrow, and winding Angorna, bright meadows enliven its entrance. The mountains on either hand are clothed with the vine, the mulberry, and the chestnut. Anon, the valley contracts. It becomes rough with projecting rocks and shady with great trees. A few spaces, not spaces, a few paces farther, and it expands into a circular basin, feathery with birches, musical with falling waters, environed atop by naked crags, fringed with dark pines, while the white peak looks down out of heaven. A little in advance, the valley seems shut in by a mountainous wall, drawn right across it and beyond, towering sublimely upward, is seen an assemblage of snow capped Alps, amid which is placed the valley we are in quest of, where burned of old the candle of the Waldenses. Some terrible convulsion has rent this mountain from top to bottom, opening a path through it to the valley beyond. We enter the dark chasm and proceed along on a narrow ledge in the mountain side, hung halfway between the torrent which is heard thundering in the abyss below, and the summits which lean over us above. Journeying thus for about 2 miles, we find the pass beginning to widen, the light to break in, and now we arrive at the gate of the Pra. There opens before us a noble circular valley, its grassy bottom watered by torrents, its sides dotted with dwellings and clothed with cornfields and pasturages, with a ring of white peaks encircling it above. This was the inner sanctuary of the Waldensian temple. The rest of Italy had turned aside to idols. The Waldensian territory alone had been reserved for the worship of the true God. And was it not meet that on its native soil a remnant of the Apostolic Church of Italy should be maintained, that Rome and all Christendom might have before their eyes a perpetual monument of what they themselves had once been, and a living witness to testify how far they had departed from their first faith? And that ends the preface and chapter 1. Oh, that valley sounds absolutely beautiful, doesn't it? It's amazing. All right, brothers and sisters, we're going to end that there. And we may pick up later. I'm not positive. My hip is really kind of hurting me, so we'll see what happens later on. But keep your eyes on Jesus, brothers and sisters. Your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And embed the Word of God upon the tablets of your hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived. Till next time, bye bye.